Welcome to the SBC Year 10 English Reading Comparing Podcasts. I'm Matt Hurley, Director of Additional Needs at St Bernard's, and I will be the host in a series of podcasts where staff members have professional but casual conversations on aspects of this unit of study. I hope you find them useful addition to your working class. So now, on the episode. Hello. In 1960, two texts of importance were published independently of each other, and yet today we find that they are both worthy of study simultaneously. One is a play set in England during the reign of Henry VIII. It was originally made for television in 1954, but reworked when the playwright became more well known. The other is a novel, the first novel to be published by the then young female New York writer whose narrative is set in her native state of Alabama, in the segregated Deep South of her childhood. The playwright is Robert Bolt, and his play A Man for All Seasons was an instant success in the London West End and then New York's Broadway. It was later turned into a movie, and Bolt went on to be the chief scriptwriter for film classics such as Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Zhivago, and The Mission. The novelist is Harper Lee, whose book To Kill a Mockingbird was awarded the Pulitzer Prize a year after publication, and is so widely admired that when the British Librarians Society constructed their list of books everyone should read before they die, they rated it as more important than the Bible. In part one of this podcast, I will discuss To Kill a Mockingbird with Mr. Stephen Murphy, VC English and Philosophy teacher. In part two, Mr. Brendan Tollett, Year 12 coordinator and VC Performing Arts teacher, will join me to discuss ways of reading A Man for All Seasons. And in part three, I'm joined by Ms. Edwina Hurley, English coordinator at SBC. So, Steve, I'll start with you. I've asked you to come in because you know To Kill a Mockingbird fairly well, intimately perhaps. And I would like to get your thoughts on why this is a text that we should be getting our Year 10s to read.
Well, firstly, I find that the way she uses language is inspiring, it's beautiful. She uses phrases and metaphors, similes, just like this one here, where she talks about women who live in Macon. She says, ladies bathe before noon, after their 3 o'clock naps, and by nightfall we're like soft tea cakes with frostings of sweat and sweet talcum. What an incredible image she's created. I could just see all these plump, pampered women at night time just sweating away.
Yeah, just in the heat of Alabama summer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the language, you can't get past the themes, the universal themes she delves into, but there's also what she doesn't say. Also, I find really intriguing.
So what do you mean by that when you say what she doesn't say? Is she leaving out bits for the reader to imagine?
She does. There are certain issues in her own life she doesn't address, but they come through covertly. But even in her language, when she writes about, for example, Miss Maudie, and she tells us that she's a widow, and in the following paragraph she makes some reference to the Second Battle of Marne, where she's pulling out weeds, and you can't help but just sort of draw the connections. She's a widow, her husband is obviously a casualty of World War One. He was killed in the Battle of Marne. It's just very clever the way she's able to do that. Yeah.
So there's layers within layers of this.
Exactly.
Book.
Yeah.
It would be fair to think that the layers that you're finding are not the layers that are going to come immediately to the mind of a Year 10 student.
No.
So what would you say to a Year 10 student who takes one look at this book and feels slightly daunted? I mean, they hear from people like you and me that it's a great book and they should read it. They hear from the librarians of Britain that it's better than the Bible, but they might not see it. So how can we help them?
I think there's a couple of ways you can approach it. Firstly, the first part of the book, it's a series of anecdotes from a period of time leading up to the trial. And these anecdotes are quite funny. The mischievous kids sort of getting up to all sorts of mayhem. It's written from the perspective of a 9-10-year-old child that has that naivety and innocence to it. And I also think that as you're reading it, just love saying the phrases, the metaphors, the similes that just sort of roll off your tongue and just enjoy the images that they create. That, to me, I find a great way to get into the novel.
Yeah, okay. So worry less about the why am I reading the sentence? Do I need to remember this for a test? And just enjoy it.
Enjoy the language.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. The way the words flow.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. There's a very famous movie of the text. What are your thoughts on that movie? Do you think that that's got some benefit for students to watch as maybe an aid to getting their head around what's going on in this text, or is it a distraction?
No, I've always been a supporter of watching a good movie that sticks faithfully to the text, and this one does. There are a number of sort of directorial changes. A couple of the characters are morphed into one, but if the teacher is able to point that out at the beginning, the students can work it out. But what I love about what I tend to do is I'll read passages and then I'll show movie up to that point and then continue reading and showing. And then that way I find we cover it quite well and it's reinforced visually. But the other thing that I really love about it is that you can't help but when you read it, to read it with this sort of southern drawl.
Right. So think of a Yole sort of Alabama Forrest Gump style twang.
Yeah.
And off you go. And we're back with part 2. And with me is Mr. Brendan Tollett.
Good morning, or good afternoon, or whenever you're listening to this.
Yeah, in Podland, time is not
irrelevant.
Yeah, it is irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. Brendan, your involvement in performance, your involvement in English is really valuable to us here because what I'd like to discuss with you specifically is the idea of how do you read a play on paper.
Sure.
How does a student reading a book's fairly straightforward. Reading a play is not. What's involved in that?
I think the number one thing that I teach when I teach a play is to read the entire text. Now that seems like the most obvious piece of advice ever, but generally we tend to read the dialogue after the character, we're given the character whose spoken dialogue it is, and we very much disregard the stage directions.
Yeah.
I suppose the inference of how that dialogue is meant to have been read. So, there's a great piece in the text that says, I think it's even Wolsey says, "Bring him to me," or something to that effect, and it says inaudibly. So it tells so much about that character or that character's purpose without having to say, distressed, Wolsey says, "Bring him to me." So reading those stage directions is really, really, really important, especially when you're not seeing something in action. In a book, the author has the narrative of the time to develop that narrative, to describe landscape, to describe character appearance, to describe feeling or emotion, but a playwright doesn't. So they're very limited to include, stage directions in parenthesis or feelings in parenthesis. But we generally look over that because it's in parenthesis, and a lot of people don't get what the author or the playwright is intending by including that really vital information.
Yep.
So when I say read the entire text, it's the most ridiculous thing for an English teacher to say. But when you're reading a play, you must read the brackets. Otherwise, it doesn't work. It's half the story told.
Okay.